They had trained for this moment for months. The night air on Guadalcanal was thick with humidity and the smell of rotting vegetation. It was the early morning hours of October 13th, 1942, and men of the Japanese Sendai Division's 29th Infantry Regiment were moving through the jungle in near-total darkness. Their officers had given them explicit instructions. When the signal came, they would charge the American positions on the ridgeline with bayonets fixed. They would overwhelm the enemy through shock and aggression. They would break through the Marine lines before dawn. The Marines on the other side of that ridgeline were exhausted, undernourished, and outnumbered. They had been fighting on Guadalcanal since August 7th. Supply lines were tenuous, reinforcements were scarce, but they had something the Japanese infantry advancing toward them did not fully understand. They had the Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, and they had trained extensively in how to use it to create interlocking fields of fire that could stop massed infantry assaults. When the Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle tree line and began their charge, screaming battle cries and moving at a full run toward the Marine positions, the BARs opened fire. The sound was distinctive, a rapid hammering that was deeper and slower than a machine gun, but far faster than rifle fire. 550 rounds per minute. The Japanese infantry, who had been told that American soldiers would break and run when faced with a determined bayonet charge, discovered something different. They discovered that doctrine developed for fighting Chinese armies in Manchuria did not translate to fighting United States Marines armed with automatic weapons. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The battle that unfolded on that ridgeline, which would later be called Edson's Ridge, or Bloody Ridge, depending on who was telling the story, represented a fundamental clash between two military philosophies. On one side was the Japanese Imperial Army's infantry doctrine, built on the concept of offensive spirit, night attacks, and the psychological power of the bayonet charge. On the other side was the American military's embrace of firepower, automatic weapons at the squad level, and the principle that well-aimed bullets were more effective than cold steel. The question at the heart of this story is not simply who won the battle. The historical record makes that clear enough. The question is more profound and more unsettling for the men who experienced it. What happens when an army's entire tactical doctrine, the very foundation of how it trains soldiers and fights wars, proves catastrophically inadequate against an enemy with superior equipment and different tactical principles? What is the psychological cost when men realize that the tactics they have been taught, the tactics that worked against previous enemies, will get them killed against this new opponent? The Japanese infantry advancing toward Marine positions that October morning believed in their training. They believed in their tactics. They had experienced success using these same methods in China, where Chinese forces often lacked the automatic weapons and the defensive discipline that the Marines possessed. They were confident, well-trained, and committed to their mission. They were also walking into a killing ground, created by a weapon system that fundamentally changed the mathematics of infantry combat. The Browning automatic rifle was not just another gun. It was the manifestation of a different approach to warfare, one that prioritized industrial firepower over individual warrior spirit. The Japanese Army's commitment to offensive infantry tactics and the bayonet charge was not a product of ignorance or backwardness. It was a deliberate doctrinal choice, rooted in Japan's military history and shaped by specific combat experiences. To understand why Japanese soldiers charged American positions in the face of overwhelming automatic weapons fire, it is necessary to understand the world they came from and the beliefs that had been drilled into them since the day they entered military service. The foundation of Japanese infantry doctrine in World War II was established decades earlier, during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. In that conflict, Japanese infantry had achieved remarkable victories against a European power through aggressive offensive tactics, night attacks, and willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of objectives. At the Battle of Mukden in March 1905, Japanese forces launched repeated infantry assaults against fortified Russian positions, suffering enormous casualties, but ultimately forcing a Russian withdrawal. The lesson Japanese military planners took from this was that offensive spirit and willingness to close with the enemy could overcome defensive firepower. This doctrinal emphasis was codified in the 1930s as Japan's military prepared for conflict in China and potential war with Western powers. The Infantry Manual, issued by the Imperial Japanese Army and refined through multiple editions, explicitly stated that the bayonet charge was the decisive moment in infantry combat. Officers were taught that firepower alone could not win battles. Victory came from the shock of close combat, from the psychological effect of soldiers charging with fixed bayonets, from the willingness to engage the enemy at intimate range where courage and fighting spirit mattered more than industrial capacity. Japanese infantry training reflected these beliefs in concrete ways. Recruits spent extensive time practicing bayonet techniques. They learned to scream battle cries designed to intimidate enemies and strengthen their own resolve. They were taught that dying in a charge was honorable, that retreat was shameful, and that individual survival was less important than unit success. The training was physically brutal and psychologically demanding, designed to create soldiers who would not hesitate when ordered to attack regardless of the odds. The emphasis on night attacks was another key element of Japanese doctrine. Japanese planners recognized that their infantry often faced enemies with superior firepower. Night attacks negated some of that advantage by limiting visibility and making coordinated defensive fire more difficult. Japanese soldiers trained extensively in night movement, learning to navigate by minimal light and to maintain unit cohesion in darkness. Officers carried swords rather than rifles, both as symbols of their status and as practical weapons in the close-range fighting that night attacks often produced. This doctrine had proven effective in China. From the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 through the full-scale war that began, in 1937, Japanese infantry tactics achieved consistent success. Chinese forces, often poorly equipped and with limited training, frequently broke when faced with determined Japanese night attacks and bayonet charges. Japanese soldiers gained combat experience and confidence. Their doctrine was validated by years of victory. The problem was that Chinese military forces in the 1930s were not equivalent to the United States Marine Corps in 1942. Chinese armies often lacked automatic weapons at the squad and platoon level. They frequently had inadequate training in defensive tactics and fire discipline. Their logistics and supply systems were poor, leaving units without adequate ammunition for sustained defensive fire. The weapon that would define American infantry tactics in the Pacific, and the weapon that would shatter Japanese confidence in their bayonet charge doctrine, began its development during World War I. John Moses Browning, already renowned for designing successful firearms, started working on an automatic rifle in 1917. The United States Army wanted a weapon that could be carried by individual soldiers, but provide the sustained fire of a light machine gun. Browning delivered exactly what they requested. The Browning automatic rifle, formerly designated the M1918, was a selective fire weapon that could shoot in either semi-automatic or fully automatic mode. It chambered the .30-06 Springfield cartridge, the same powerful round used in the standard M1000-903 Springfield rifle, and later the M1 Garand. This commonality of ammunition simplified logistics and ensured that the BAR had effective range and stopping power. The weapon weighed 19.5 pounds when loaded with a 20-round magazine, making it heavy but still portable for a trained infantryman. The bar's design reflected Browning's genius for creating reliable, functional weapons. It used a gas-operated system where expanding gases from a fired round drove a piston that cycled the action, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a new round. The system was simple, robust, and continued functioning even when the weapon was dirty or poorly maintained. In the jungles and islands of the Pacific, where rust, mud, sand, and salt water constantly threatened to disable weapons, this reliability was crucial. The cyclic rate of fire for the BAR was approximately 550 rounds per minute when fired in fully automatic mode. This was slower than true machine guns like the Browning M1919, which fired at rates exceeding 500 rounds per minute, but it was far faster than any standard rifle. A trained BAR man could fire controlled bursts of 3 to 5 rounds or sustain longer bursts when the tactical situation demanded it. The 20-round magazine limited sustained fire, but it also kept the weapon light enough for one man to carry and operate. American infantry doctrine in World War II built around the BAR as a key element of rifle squad firepower. Each 12-man rifle squad had one BAR, along with 11 men armed with M1 Garand rifles. The barman, called the automatic rifleman, was supported by an assistant who carried additional magazines and helped change barrels when necessary. In combat, the BAR provided the base of fire around which squad tactics developed. Riflemen maneuvered while the BAR suppressed enemy positions. The BAR covered advances and provided defensive firepower against attacking forces. The Marines, who would face Japanese infantry charges throughout the Pacific War, placed even greater emphasis on the BAR than the Army. Marine rifle squads often had 2 BARs instead of 1, doubling the automatic weapons firepower available at the squad level. This reflected lessons learned in the Banana Wars and small unit actions in Central America during the 1920s and 1930s, where Marines had discovered that firepower superiority at the lowest tactical level made an enormous difference in jungle fighting and small unit engagements. Training with the BAR was extensive. Marines learned to fire from prone, sitting, and standing positions. They practiced changing magazines quickly under stress. They learned to clear jams, though the weapon rarely jammed when properly maintained. Most importantly, they learned fire discipline, how to fire controlled bursts rather than emptying magazines in panic, how to conserve ammunition while still maintaining effective fire. A well-trained BAR man could put accurate fire on target at ranges up to 600 yards. Though most combat engagements in the Pacific occurred at much closer distances where the weapon's full automatic capability became decisive, the Japanese soldiers who would face Marine BARs on Guadalcanal in October 1942 were not untrained conscripts. They were men of the Sendai Division, officially designated the 2nd Infantry Division of the Imperial, Japanese Army. The division had been formed in 1888 and had fought in the Russo-Japanese War, earning a reputation for aggressive tactics and offensive spirit. By 1942, the division was composed of veteran soldiers, many with combat experience from the war in China. The Sendai Division landed on Guadalcanal, beginning in early October 1942 with a specific mission. American Marines had seized the island's partially completed airfield in August, threatening Japanese control of the Solomon Islands and the sea lanes to Australia. Imperial General Headquarters ordered the recapture of Guadalcanal and the destruction of American forces on the island. The Sendai Division, under the command of Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, would be the primary striking force. The Japanese plan called for a coordinated attack from multiple directions, with the main effort coming from south of the airfield, where Marines had established defensive positions on a series of ridges. Japanese intelligence estimated American strength at approximately 2,000 Marines in the Henderson Field perimeter. The actual number was closer to 4,000, but even this was less than the Japanese force being assembled for the attack. The Sendai Division alone numbered over 15,000 men when it landed, though jungle movement, disease, and inadequate logistics would reduce effective combat strength significantly. Japanese soldiers moved through the jungle carrying minimal equipment. Each man had his Arisaka Type 38 rifle, a weapon that dated to 1905, but remained the standard Japanese infantry rifle throughout World War II. The Type 38 was a bolt-action rifle chambered for the 6.5mm cartridge, lighter and lower powered than the American .30-06 round. Each soldier carried between 60 and 120 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips, along with a bayonet, entrenching tool, and minimal rations. Officers carried swords as symbols of their rank and as weapons for close combat. The Japanese supply situation on Guadalcanal was already deteriorating by October. American control of Henderson Field and the surrounding waters during daylight hours made resupply difficult. Japanese convoys could only approach the island at night, offloading supplies and reinforcements in hasty operations before withdrawing at dawn. This limited what could be brought ashore. Food was inadequate. Medical supplies were scarce, artillery and heavy weapons were in short supply. But the Japanese command believed that aggressive infantry tactics could overcome these disadvantages. The Sendai Division's 29th Infantry Regiment, under Colonel Furumiya Masajiro, received orders to attack the Marine positions on what the Americans called Edson's Ridge. The ridge was a series of grass-covered hills south of Henderson Field, defended by approximately 750 Marines of the 1st Raider Battalion, the 1st Parachute Battalion, both under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson. The Japanese significantly outnumbered the defenders, but they would be attacking uphill against prepared positions. Japanese soldiers moved into position on the night of October 12th. They carried their rifles, their bayonets, and the belief that their training and offensive spirit would carry them through. Many had fought in China where these tactics succeeded. None had faced American Marines armed with BARs and trained to use them in coordinated defensive fire. The Marines on the ridge knew the Japanese were coming. Patrols had detected enemy movement. Intelligence reports indicated a major attack was imminent. The Marines dug foxholes, positioned their weapons to create overlapping fields of fire, and waited. The first Japanese assault began shortly after nightfall on October 12th. Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle south of the ridge and began moving toward Marine positions. The attack was not a wild, disorganized charge. It was a coordinated movement with officers directing their men forward, attempting to maintain formation in the darkness. Japanese doctrine called for surprise and shock, but the Marines were alert and waiting. Marine sentries spotted the advancing Japanese infantry and called warnings. Officers shouted orders. Barmen checked their magazines and adjusted their positions. Then the first Japanese soldiers broke into a run, screaming battle cries and charging uphill with bayonets fixed. The Marines opened fire. M1 Garands cracked in rapid semi-automatic fire. BARs hammered out sustained bursts. The sound was overwhelming, drowning out even the Japanese battle cries. The effect of concentrated automatic weapons fire on massed infantry was immediate and devastating. Japanese soldiers running uphill in the darkness found themselves in a killing zone where multiple BARs created intersecting fields of fire. A BAR firing at 550 rounds per minute could put 9 rounds downrange in 1 second. With multiple BARs firing simultaneously, the volume of fire was staggering. Japanese soldiers fell in groups. Those behind them stumbled over bodies and kept advancing. Marine barmen fired controlled bursts, changed magazines, and resumed firing. One Marine private, later interviewed about the battle, described watching Japanese soldiers emerge from the tree line approximately 50 yards away. His BAR was positioned to fire down the ridge slope. When the charge began, he fired 3-round bursts at the lead ranks, then sustained bursts at the mass of soldiers behind them. His assistant fed him fresh magazines as quickly as he could empty them. He estimated he fired 200 rounds in the first minutes of the assault. Around him, other BARs were firing continuously. The Japanese advance stalled, reformed, and came again. The Japanese soldiers experiencing this fire were facing something they had not encountered in China. The volume of automatic weapons fire was far greater than anything Chinese armies could produce. The Marines maintained fire discipline, with barmen timing their magazine changes so that some weapons were always firing. There was no gap in the defensive fire for Japanese infantry to exploit. When one BAR went silent to reload, another continued firing. The intersecting fields of fire meant that Japanese soldiers could not find dead zones where they could advance without being engaged. Japanese officers, recognizing the initial assault was failing, reorganized their men and ordered another attack. The second wave charged into the same devastating fire. BARs continued hammering. M1 Garands added their fire. Japanese casualties mounted. Some Japanese soldiers reached within 20 yards of Marine positions before being cut down. A few reached the Marine foxholes and engaged in close combat with bayonets and entrenching tools before being killed. But the vast majority never made it, past the killing zone where BAR fire was most concentrated. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological impact on Japanese survivors was profound. These were soldiers who had been taught that the bayonet charge was the decisive moment in combat. They had trained for this. They had practiced charging and screaming and closing with the enemy. The doctrine promised that American soldiers would break when faced with determined assault. Instead, the Marines held their positions and maintained disciplined fire. Charged again and died again. The equation did not work. The doctrine that had succeeded in China was failing catastrophically on Guadalcanal. The main Japanese assault came the following night, October 13th. General Maruyama committed approximately 3,000 soldiers to a coordinated attack aimed at overwhelming the Marine positions through sheer numbers and repeated waves. The Japanese plan called for continuous pressure, attacking in successive waves throughout the night to exhaust the defenders and break through before dawn. Japanese commanders believed that even with heavy casualties, the numerical advantage would eventually tell. The Marines on Edson's Ridge had approximately 750 men in defensive positions. They were outnumbered 4-1, but they had defensive terrain, prepared positions, and most critically, they had automatic weapons at the squad level and the training to use them effectively. Each Marine rifle squad had at least one BAR, many had two. The defensive line bristled with automatic weapons firepower that could create a wall of bullets against attacking infantry. The Japanese assault began shortly after 2100 hours. Thousands of Japanese soldiers advanced through the jungle darkness toward the ridge. When they emerged into the open ground, approaching Marine positions, officers ordered the charge. Japanese infantry ran forward, screaming battle cries, bayonets fixed, moving at a full run up the slopes. The Marines opened fire with everything they had. BARs fired sustained bursts. M1 Garrons added rapid semi-automatic fire. Machine gun positions with Browning M1000. 917 water-cooled guns fired longer sustained bursts. Artillery behind the lines fired illumination rounds that lit the battlefield with harsh white light, revealing masses of Japanese infantry in the open. The BAR fire was the key to the Marine defense. While machine guns provided sustained fire from fixed positions, BARs gave squad leaders the flexibility to shift automatic weapons fire to threatened points in the line. When Japanese infantry concentrated their assault on one section of the ridge, Marine squad leaders moved their barmen to reinforce that position. The 20-round BAR magazines were a limitation, requiring frequent reloading, but they also kept the weapon light enough to be mobile and responsive to changing tactical situations. Japanese soldiers who survived the initial fire and reached the Marine positions found themselves in close quarters fighting where the bar's automatic fire was devastating at ranges measured in feet rather than yards. Marines fired their BARs from the hip or from prone positions directly into advancing Japanese infantry. At these ranges, the .30-06 rounds had enormous stopping power. The kinetic energy of each round was sufficient to knock a man down even when striking non-vital areas. Multiple hits were instantly fatal. The fighting continued through the night with waves of Japanese attacks separated by brief pauses while Japanese officers reorganized their men. Each wave crashed against the Marine defensive fire and broke. Japanese casualties accumulated in front of the Marine positions. Bodies piled up in some areas, creating obstacles that following waves had to climb over or go around. The grass on the ridge slopes, already trampled by hundreds of feet, became soaked with blood. The smell of gunpowder and death filled the humid night air. By dawn on October 14th, the Japanese assault had failed. Japanese forces withdrew, leaving behind approximately 650 dead soldiers in front of the Marine positions. Marine casualties were approximately 60 killed. The numerical disparity in casualties, more than 10-1, reflected the advantage of defensive positions and superior firepower. It also reflected the fundamental mismatch between Japanese infantry tactics and American weapons systems. The bayonet charge doctrine had failed decisively when applied against automatic weapons fired by disciplined, well-supplied defenders. The Japanese soldiers who survived the battle for Edson's Ridge returned to their units, carrying knowledge that contradicted everything their training had taught them. The bayonet charge, the centerpiece of Japanese infantry doctrine, had failed utterly against American automatic weapons fire. Officers attempting to make sense of what happened wrote reports that struggled to explain the defeat without acknowledging fundamental flaws in their tactical approach. Some blamed inadequate artillery support. Others cited poor coordination between units or difficult terrain. Few were willing to state the obvious conclusion that their infantry tactics were obsolete against an enemy with superior firepower. Colonel Furumiya, commanding the 29th Infantry Regiment, filed an after-action report that noted the Americans possessed extraordinary firepower and maintained excellent fire discipline. He observed that Marine positions were mutually supporting, making it difficult to isolate and destroy individual strongpoints. But his report still recommended aggressive night attacks and close assault tactics for future operations. The institutional commitment to offensive doctrine was so deeply embedded that even devastating defeats could not immediately change it. Private accounts from Japanese survivors painted a bleaker picture. Soldiers who had charged American positions and somehow survived described the experience as walking into a wall of fire. They talked about the continuous sound of automatic weapons, the impossibility of advancing when bullets were coming from multiple directions simultaneously, the horror of watching entire squads cut down in seconds. Some expressed anger that they had been ordered to make such attacks. Others remained committed to the doctrine, but recognized they lacked the equipment to make it work against American firepower. The Marines who defended Edson Ridge understood immediately what their BARs had accomplished. The volume of fire from squad-level automatic weapons had been the decisive factor in stopping the Japanese assault. Without the BARs, Marine riflemen armed only with bolt-action, Springfield rifles would have struggled to generate enough firepower to stop massed infantry charges. The M1 Garand's semi-automatic capability helped, but it was the BARs firing full automatic that created the killing zones where Japanese attacks broke down. Marine commanders incorporated these lessons into tactical doctrine for subsequent operations. The emphasis on squad-level automatic weapons increased. Training focused on creating interlocking fields of fire where BARs could support each other. Ammunition supply for BARs became a priority, with units carrying extra magazines and ensuring BAR teams had sufficient ammunition for sustained defensive fire. The BAR's role evolved from simply providing suppressive fire to being the anchor of squad defensive positions. The pattern established at Guadalcanal repeated throughout the Pacific War. At Tarawa, in November 1943, Japanese defenders launched counterattacks against Marine beachheads. Marine BARs firing from defensive positions cut down the attackers. At Saipan in June 1944, Japanese infantry charged American positions in desperate banzai attacks. BARs and machine guns created killing fields where Japanese soldiers died by the hundreds. At Peleliu in September 1944, at Iwo Jima in February 1945, at Okinawa from April through June 1945, the same tactical dynamic played out repeatedly. Japanese military leadership never fundamentally revised their infantry doctrine despite overwhelming evidence that it was failing. Institutional inertia, cultural factors emphasizing offensive spirit, and the difficulty of completely retraining an army in wartime all contributed to this failure to adapt. Japanese soldiers continued launching bayonet charges and night attacks against American positions throughout the war. The casualties were horrific, and the tactical results were negligible. The Imperial Japanese Army's commitment to offensive doctrine had become a death sentence for its infantry. The tactical superiority, American infantry firepower reflected deeper differences in industrial capacity and military philosophy. The United States could equip every rifle squad with a BAR because American factories could produce BARs in enormous quantities. The weapon was manufactured at several facilities, including the Colt Patent Firearms Company in Hartford, Connecticut, the Marlin Rockwell Corporation, and the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. Production numbers are instructive. By the end of World War II, American industry had produced approximately 351,000 BARs in various models. Japan had no equivalent weapon in comparable numbers. The Japanese Type 11 light machine gun, introduced in 1922, was intended to provide squad-level automatic fire. but it was heavier than the BAR at 22 pounds, more complex mechanically, and less reliable in field conditions. The Type 11 used a hopper feeding system that took cartridges from standard rifle stripper clips rather than using dedicated magazines. This was intended to simplify ammunition supply, but in practice, the system was prone to jamming and required frequent maintenance. More critically, Japanese industry produced only 29,000 Type 11 machine guns during its entire production run, from 1922 to 1941. The Type 96 light machine gun, which replaced the Type 11 starting in 1936, was a better weapon. It weighed approximately 20 pounds, used a top-mounted magazine holding 30 rounds of 6.5mm ammunition, and had a cyclic rate of approximately 550 rounds per minute, the same as the BAR. But production numbers remained limited. Approximately 41,000 Type 96 machine guns were manufactured during the war. This meant that many Japanese infantry squads lacked any automatic weapon at all, while others had to share a single light machine gun between multiple squads. The disparity extended beyond raw production numbers to the entire logistics system supporting infantry operations. American supply chains delivered ammunition in quantities that seemed wasteful by Japanese standards. A Marine rifle company could call for resupply and receive thousands of rounds of .30-06 ammunition for its BARs within hours or days, depending on the tactical situation. Japanese units often operated on severely restricted ammunition allocations, with soldiers carrying fewer than 100 rounds per rifle and machine gun crews having limited belts for sustained fire. The philosophical difference was equally significant. American military doctrine embraced firepower as the solution to tactical problems. When facing a fortified position, American infantry called for artillery, air support, and concentrated small arms fire. American squad leaders were taught to use their BARs to suppress enemy positions, while riflemen maneuvered. The entire tactical system was built around the premise that superior firepower, properly applied, could defeat any enemy. Japanese doctrine emphasized spirit, aggression, and willingness to accept casualties. Japanese officers were taught that morale and offensive determination could overcome material disadvantages. The bayonet charge was not just a tactic, it was an expression of Japanese military values. To abandon the charge was to abandon the essence of what made Japanese soldiers distinct. This cultural commitment to offensive spirit made it psychologically and institutionally difficult to adapt to tactical realities. Japanese soldiers paid the price for this doctrinal rigidity. At Guadalcanal, Japanese casualties in the various battles for Henderson Field totaled approximately 15,000, killed out of approximately 31,000 men committed to the island. Many died in failed infantry charges against American positions. At Tarawa, Japanese defenders launched banzai charges that resulted in almost complete annihilation of the garrison. At Saipan, approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers participated in one of the largest banzai charges of the war on July 7, 1944. American firepower killed the vast majority before they reached American lines. The survivors were hunted down in the following days. The mathematics were unforgiving. A Japanese infantry squad of 13 men, armed with bolt-action rifles and perhaps one light machine gun if they were fortunate, could not generate the firepower of an American rifle squad with 11 M1 Garans and 2 BARs. When Japanese squads charged American positions, they were bringing inferior firepower into direct confrontation with superior firepower. The outcome was predetermined by the capabilities of the weapons systems involved. The story of Japanese infantry charges against American BARs is not primarily a story of cowardice or courage. Japanese soldiers who charged into automatic weapons fire demonstrated physical bravery that is difficult to comprehend. They ran uphill toward positions they could see were firing at them. They watched their comrades fall and kept advancing. They followed orders that sent them into situations where survival was unlikely. Their courage was never in question. The story is instead about the consequences of doctrinal rigidity and industrial disparity in modern warfare. The Imperial Japanese Army developed its infantry doctrine in an earlier era and refined it through experience fighting enemies who lacked the firepower and defensive capabilities of American forces. When Japanese infantry encountered American Marines armed with BARs and trained to use them effectively, the doctrine failed. But institutional inertia, cultural factors, and wartime constraints prevented fundamental revision of that doctrine. Japanese soldiers continued charging into automatic weapons fire throughout the war because their commanders could not or would not change the tactics that defined Japanese infantry identity. The American Marines and soldiers who fired those BARs were not executing some brilliant tactical innovation. They were applying straightforward defensive tactics using reliable weapons that their nation's industry provided in abundance. The BAR gave American infantry squads the automatic firepower needed to stop massed infantry charges. The weapon was not revolutionary. It had been designed in 1917, but it was good enough, and it was available in quantities sufficient to equip the force. That combination of adequate technology and overwhelming industrial capacity defined American military success throughout World War II. For the Japanese soldiers at Guadalcanal who survived those first encounters with concentrated BAR fire, the psychological impact was profound and permanent. They had believed their training would protect them. They had trusted their doctrine. They had confidence born from victories in China. All of that shattered when they charged into automatic weapons fire and watched their units disintegrate. Some survived by luck, by being in the second or third wave when American ammunition ran low, by finding dead ground where the BARs could not reach them. They returned to their units and tried to explain what they had experienced, but words were inadequate. The men who fired those BARs carried their own burdens. Killing at close range, even in self-defense and in war, marks people. Marine barmen at Guadalcanal and subsequent battles fired thousands of rounds into charging Japanese infantry. They watched men fall. They saw the results of their fire. Some adapted and became efficient killers. Others were haunted by what they had done even as they recognized it was necessary. The BAR was an effective weapon for stopping infantry charges, but using it in that role required men to kill in volume at close range. That psychological cost was real even in victory. The broader lesson extends beyond the specific weapon system or the particular battles. Modern industrial warfare favors nations that can produce superior equipment in overwhelming quantities and develop doctrine that effectively employs that equipment. Japan in World War II had neither advantage. Its industry could not match American production. Its doctrine emphasized factors like morale and offensive spirit that could not overcome material disadvantages. Japanese soldiers fought with courage and determination, but they fought with inadequate equipment, according to obsolete doctrine, against an enemy with overwhelming advantages in firepower and logistics. When those Japanese infantrymen emerged from the jungle on Guadalcanal and charged up Edson's Ridge into concentrated BAR fire, they were not just attacking a defensive position. They were colliding with the reality of industrial warfare in the 20th century. The BARs firing at 550 rounds per minute represented American industrial capacity, American tactical doctrine, and American willingness to apply firepower rather than manpower as the solution to tactical problems. The bayonet charges represented Japanese commitment to offensive spirit, Japanese belief in the primacy of morale over material, and Japanese inability to adapt doctrine to new realities. The outcome was never in doubt. Once the capabilities and doctrines were set, Japanese infantry would charge, American BARs would fire, Japanese soldiers would die in numbers that shocked even hardened combat veterans. The tragic element was not that Japanese soldiers lost, but that they continued fighting according to doctrine they knew was failing because their military system could not or would not change. The cost of that institutional failure was measured in thousands of lives, in failed attacks repeated across dozens of islands, in the final desperate banzai charges that accomplished nothing except adding to the casualty lists. The Marines who defended Edson's Ridge and fired their BARs into charging Japanese infantry understood they had experienced something significant. They had stopped a numerically superior enemy through firepower and defensive discipline. They had validated their training and their weapons. They had survived. But they also understood they had participated in a kind of industrial slaughter where the outcome was determined as much by factories in Connecticut and Michigan as by anything that happened on that ridge in the darkness. That knowledge, that understanding of modern war's industrial nature, would define the American military experience for the rest of the 20th century. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.